Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Elena, and I run events at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Nana's debut book, The Sex Lives of African Women, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until after 95 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nance Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors, and writers such as Nana and Mona, we wouldn't be here today. We are thrilled to have Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah with us for a discussion of her debut book, The Sex Lives of African Women, Self-Discovery, Freedom, and Healing. Nana is the author of The Sex Lives of African Women, which Publishers Weekly described as an astonishing report on the quest for sexual liberation in their starred review. It was also listed by The Economist as Best Book of the Year. She's an award-winning blogger and co-founder of Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, a website, podcast, and festival that publishes and creates content that tells stories of African women's experiences around sex, sexualities, and pleasure. The impact of Nana's work has been documented by CNN in a film titled Not Yet Satisfied. Joining Nana in conversation is Mona Eltahawy. Mona is the founder and editor-in-chief of the newsletter Feminist Giant. She is a public speaker on global feminism and is the author of Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, Targeted Patriarchy in the Middle East and North Africa, and The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, which took her disruption to patriarchy worldwide. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nana and Mona to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name, as you just heard, is Mona Eltahawy, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I begin everything as I always do with my declaration of faith, fuck the patriarchy. And I'm hoping that we will be doing exactly that, figuratively, not literally, over the next hour or so. And Nana, welcome. Where are you joining us from?
Thank you so much, Mona. It's great to be in conversation with you. I'm joining from Accra, Ghana. So yeah, it's 11 p.m. my world.
Thank you so much for staying up. I'm sure that this conversation is going to have many of us staying up, especially when we post it online and people, excuse me, can watch it again and again. Now, before we do get to our excellent conversation, Nana, I invite you to read, I think I asked you to read any one of your favorite passages from the book. So the stage, the figurative stage is all yours. Please go ahead.
Okay. I mean, it's so hard to pick a favorite passage, but then when I was leafing through the story of Yami was speaking to me today, and just to give some background, Yami, as her family originally comes from Malawi, and they moved to Canada when she was like 2 or 3 years old. So I'm just going to read from the beginning of her story. I remember years ago going to see my gynecologist and my naturopath because I was concerned that I could not orgasm through sex. Is my pussy broken? I asked. They said, no, you're just having bad sex. It took me a while to realize that part of the issue was bad sex, the other aspect was trauma. In most of my former sexual relationships, I had rarely orgasmed. Sex at the time was more about the performance. It's the opposite in this relationship. We talk about desire, what is going on with our bodies, what we like, what we don't like. Nothing is weird in our relationship. Absolutely nothing. I'm very femme presenting, and people often assume that means I'm passive. I feel comfortable in this relationship, and so I'm able to be dominant. I've gotten to know my body in a very different way. I now know what my body likes because there's been space created for me to figure that out. Grinding on my partner, for example, feels amazing. The other day, I was pinching my nipples and got really aroused, although usually I don't like nipple play. This is the first time in a relationship that I have felt that everything is on the table and nothing is off limits sexually. When we first started dating, we would fuck like rabbits. I would have multiple orgasms and then weep uncontrollably. I thought, what the fuck is wrong with me? Why am I crying? Then I realized that too was okay. My body was healing. I was connecting both with myself and with another person. The only challenges we've experienced sexually have been around my own body dysphoria, feeling disconnected from my body and disassociating. But when I'm present with them, I'm really present with them. So that's a short excerpt from Yami's story. And
Nana, have I gone sideways again?
yes, you're sideways again.
We had this problem when we were doing, oh my goodness. Okay, I'm gonna try and fix this. Okay, how am I now?
You're good now. You're good now.
Okay, good. I'm just gonna hold it like this because I don't want to be sideways. Okay. Nana, I think you know that I love your book. I'm such a huge fan of your work. It's so revolutionary. I wish I had your book when I was growing up because, you know, I've told people, I've written about it in so many places. It took me a really long time to have sex with another person other than myself. And so reading through the stories was like listening to my younger self. I wish I had this glorious book to read because I had no one to talk to about. So let's go back to the beginning, because I remember when we met in Nigeria for the Ake Book Festival in 2015, you told me about your wonderful blog, Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women. So let's start there. What made you start this wonderful blog?
Yes, I'm happy to tell you. But Mona, we actually met in 2010. You don't remember?
South Africa,
Yes,
right.
South
Yes.
Africa. I remember hearing you speak about your experience during the revolution, and I was just blown away. So I've been a huge fan of your work since 2010, but it was also great to like meet in 2015 and subsequently meet very often. So yes, the genesis of the work I've been doing around sex and sexuality started in 2009. In a nutshell, I went on a beach holiday with a group of other African women, and it was just like the most incredible holiday. You know, we're sitting on the beach, drinking cocktails, chatting, and the conversation would turn over and over again to the topic of sex. But it felt to me like the tenor of the conversation was different. It felt to me there was this openness, there was this honesty, non-judgmental, and I just felt somehow able to open up in that space more than I had previously been able to open up. That was also around the time I turned 30. So a bit like you, Mona, I too was a late bloomer. And I just had this moment where I thought, why has it taken me this long to feel so comfortable chatting to other women about sex? And so I came back like home to the capital, because we were in the western region of Ghana, like 5 hours away from the capital, feeling like energized. And I was just like, I am going to start a blog about sex, because I just felt like I wanted to keep having that kind of space, right? Where women could speak to each other and learn from each other, because very often we're not told very much about sex growing up, and we kind of have to figure it out. And I just wanted to create a community where we could learn from one another. So that's how, in a sense, this work started. And then in 2014, I thought, actually, I want to write a book about sex. Started the process in 2015. I interviewed the first one in 2015. And yes, here we are now.
I love it. I'm sorry I'm fiddling around with my technology. This working from home business is still a challenge to me. But I'm glad I'm not sideways anymore. I love that, because, you know, one of the earliest things you say in the book is, you know, I underlined so many parts in your book, but one of the first things that I underlined was you saying in the introduction that speaking about a taboo, especially in, you know, in countries like the countries we come from the continent of Africa, is a political act. And I loved hearing that. And I loved hearing that because I know that you ground so much of your work in the politics of feminism, the politics of anti-racism, anti-homophobia, you know, in so many political issues. And I think it's so important that we talk about feminism as a political act, that we talk about sex as a political act. I often tell people, you know, how I dress is political, how I fuck is political, what I eat is political. So of course, you know, the politics of it all is at the very heart of it. So before we get to the stories, and I want to hear about how you collected them and all of that, talk to us a bit about the politics of speaking about taboos and our sex lives.
I think it's super, super important. I feel like actually the subjects we're told not to speak about, right? Sex, religion, you know, party politics. Yeah. Those are the subjects we actually have to speak about. When someone tells you not to speak about something, that's because they want you to have a limited perspective on that subject. They don't want you to discuss, they don't want you to question. And I think it's only in speaking that you sometimes start to unlearn things you've been told. It's when you realize that actually this doesn't make sense. I need to do something different. It's also when you find out you're not the only person, right? You're not the only queer person in your village, for example. There's a whole community of people out there. And I think if sex wasn't political, we still wouldn't have states and countries trying to legislate who people love or trying to reverse bills that have already been passed around marriage equality, for example. You know, right here in Ghana, we actually right now have a private members bill before our parliament where literally, you know, some parliamentarians literally want to ban people from identifying as queer. Like, as ridiculous as that sounds, literally want to ban people from accessing health services if they're queer. And for me, that tells and reminds me, and I hope everybody around me, that sex is indeed a very political act. And it is something that is important for us to speak about. Also to show we're here in all our diversities, whatever, you know, sexual identity may be.
Absolutely. Let's start also with, I mean, let's start now with the mechanics of the book, because, you know, I'm sure a lot of people watching, you know, like budding writers or something, because I remember what it was like when I was trying to get my book published. It's so many of the books that we need to read often center white women. And you address this directly, and I'm so glad you did. There are so many books that we could mention, but, you know, people can read in your book, especially one that you did mention. And, you know, we go to these books hoping to find stories that we've long wanted to read because we've been marginalized in various ways. And we finally find a book, and then, you know, the book that you mentioned in Sex Lives of African Women, I was quite excited before it came out. And then, you know, I'm paging through it and I'm like, these are all white women. How is this happening? How is a book published in the United States in, I think it was like 2019 or something, about sex and desire, centering just white women in a country like the United States today? It's just ridiculous. So how did you decide to, of course, you know, our continent is full of, you know, Black people, people of color, and some white people too. But you also had to deal with having this book published by UK publishers and US publishers now too. How did you get around that when you decided to launch your book into the world?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, right? My book is titled The Sex Lives of African Women. So it's clearly speaking to a particular audience, right? It's speaking to African women, wherever they may be, whether they're on the continent, whether they're in the diaspora, whether they're Afro-descendants. And for me, that was really, really important. You know, I also made a strategic decision to be published by a UK and a US publisher because frankly, I knew that they would have the resources to get the book distributed across the world. And so for me, one of the very early conversations I had with my UK publisher was, how are we going to get the book, you know, to like all the main markets on the continent? And I'm so pleased we've been able to do that. And yes, for me, it was very, very deliberate. You know, in my book, I featured African women, Black African women, as well as an Asian, you know, African woman, and that was deliberate. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a book for us, and at the same time, it's a book that I think no matter your racial background, you can read and enjoy and, you know, resonate with stories. I remember one of the very first interviews I did was with a journalist from Singapore. And she was saying to me how she identified with my story because I was writing about an experience of being in a Catholic boarding school. And she was like, I went to a Catholic boarding school, you know? And I think even when you tell a very, very specific story, people all over the world can connect. And I also think it's important for people from across the world to know the stories of Africans, right? And to hear the stories in expansive ways, you know, beyond sort of the stereotypes that they tend to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I remember when I heard you speak at the Africa Festival, the Royal Society of Africa Festival, Africa Rights in London last October. It was, you know, it was my first time to travel since the pandemic began. And I think you were asked a question about, you know, how did you manage to write around and in a disruptive way against the stereotypes that we too often see, especially about women from our continent? How did you manage that?
And I think you manage that by really speaking to as many people as possible, right? Because we have a lot in common, but we're also very different. And I also think we are whole human beings. So even if someone has had an experience that on one hand is stereotypical, I'll give an example. You know, I interviewed a woman who, for example, has experienced female genital mutilation. And usually in the Western media, whenever there was, you know, a portrayal of female genital mutilation, the woman is usually cast as passive, right? Well, this woman that I interviewed in my story, I named her Waris, which is a pseudonym. She was actually talking about a really pleasurable experience that she's had. So it's possible for a woman to have undergone child sexual abuse, which is what FGM is, and still find ways to access pleasure in her body. This doesn't mean, by portraying this doesn't mean I'm trying to say FGM is good. You know, I think FGM is abusive and needs to be stopped wherever it is, but I'm not going to portray a woman who has experienced FGM as somehow less than, as somehow somebody who doesn't experience desire. If there are women who are telling me, you know what, I had this really horrific experience as a child, and this is how I have healed through this experience. I'm interested in that whole story, that, you know, more interesting, more interesting, and also more true story. And I think you get that when you actually cast a wide net, you know, in seeking the stories of African women and probably women wherever they are in the world.
Yeah, and that's exactly what draws, like your Singaporean interviewer was saying, that's what draws other people, because in doing that, you complicate people, and in complicating people, you know, that term we use again and again, you humanize them. It's much more than humanizing. When you complicate, you create this incredible narrative which everyone deserves. Everyone deserves a complicated narrative because we're complicated people. So I wanted to get around those, like, you know, the broader issues, like how did you get around the publishing obstacles and avoid the stereotypes, and then kind of zone in a bit more. And you mentioned that you cast a wide net, and I know that you talk about interviewing at least 30 women. How did you decide how you're going to go about doing it? Was it like, because it's such a wonderfully diverse collection. You know, we use that word diverse so easily now, you know, to me, like, you know, I'm just going to check a whole bunch of boxes, but it's much more than that with your book, because through the diversity, you tell these complicated narratives. So it's not just, I want a woman with this and a woman with that, and a femme person with that, and a trans person with that. It's much more than that. It becomes, their identities are important, obviously, but they're much more than their identities. They become the individual women they are, that then speak to the general women, you know, that should be reading the book. So how did you set about saying, these are the women I'm going to interview for my book?
I did a couple of things. So prior to the pandemic, I used to travel quite a lot for my work. And one of the things I decided to do was every time I went to a new country, I would just find a woman in that country to interview, right? I remember going to Costa Rica and I was like, oh my God, there's so many Afro-descendant women here. I have to find a woman from Costa Rica to interview. And then once the pandemic hit, like everybody else, I had to resort to Zoom, you know. And prior to even the pandemic, I had done a call out on my blog, asking women who were interested in telling their stories to reach out to me. I did call outs on Twitter. Some people shared the call outs with people that they felt would be good for me to interview. So one of the women I interviewed in my book, Helen Banda, for instance, you know, she found me on Facebook, and I only saw her message 3 months after she'd sent it, you know, saying, you know, a friend sent me this, and I would love to be interviewed. This is my story. I had a friend introduce me to her next door neighbor who was a dominatrix from the UK. She's like, you have to interview her. So it was that mix of people. And, you know, sometimes people think, oh, you interviewed a whole bunch of people and then you chose like your favorite stories. I actually included all but one of the interviews are done, you know? Yeah, and for me, it just shows that everybody has an interesting story when it comes to the subject of sex, because it's not just about the physical act of sex, you know, it can also be about the choice not to have sex. I interviewed a woman who was celibate, for instance. You know, I was just interested in, I feel like sex is such an interesting subject, right? And it feeds into so many aspects of our life and speaks to and interacts with other aspects of our life, like our culture, how we were raised, where we are from, what we're told growing up. And so there was always a conversation I could have with someone. And I think that's what accounts for the diversity that you mentioned, Mona.
Yeah, it's wonderful, Nana, and I love the way you divided the book into like 3 parts, because as you say at the beginning, the journey towards sexual freedom is, you know, is very individual. It's not linear and it's constant. I mean, it reminded me of I was in Spain just before the pandemic, or the year before the pandemic, and there was a bookshop there that had these signs and on totes and posters and stuff that said in Arabic, freedom is a daily practice. And it kind of, and when I read, you know, in your introduction, that freedom is this constant journey that we're on. I love that, because I love the 3 parts that you frame it with: self-discovery, freedom, and healing. So let's talk through each one of the sections. Why did you begin with self-discovery?
So initially, I actually wanted to begin the book with freedom. And, you know, there was some feedback my first editor gave me. And I was like, I hear where you're coming from. I'm going to flip things around. And actually, her feedback wasn't even around the theme. So it was around the content in each theme, you know. And I was like, actually, I'm going to answer your query by doing something slightly different to what you've asked me to do, you know. And then I decided to bring self-discovery first. And the reason why I made that choice is because I feel like that's actually where most of us find ourselves, right? I feel like most of us now are starting to question things we've been told growing up. We're starting to experiment. We're starting to figure it out. And so in a sense, we're on a journey, we're trying to discover ourselves. And so I felt like if I started the book with those kind of stories, people will find, you know, stories that they could identify with, people they could resonate with, right? And then freedom for me was just like, oh my goodness, these are the people who have figured it out. They're living their best sex lives. They're like models and inspiration for all of us. And then healing was a mix, right? There were a lot of really tough stories in healing, because obviously a lot of women have also experienced a lot of trauma. And, you know, healing also included stories of how people had, in a sense, worked their way through whatever trauma. And so those were really tough stories. And my own personal story was also in the healing section. And so I decided to keep that to the end. I almost wanted people to feel strong enough to go through those tough stories.
Oh, I like the way that you put that. Well, you know, when I was reading the book, like in my mind, I was like, so if I were talking to Nana, how would I tell her my story? So I thought, so when I was reading the self-discovery, I mean, like for each section, I had a story in my head for you. So if you write a part 2, please talk to me. So for self-discovery, you know, I remember, so I was born in Egypt, as you know, and my family moved to London when I was 7. And I remember when I was about 9, one of the boys downstairs, when I would go downstairs and play with the other kids, whose dad, so my parents are doctors and his dad was a doctor, and he was adamant that his dad told him that babies come from outside, from in between a woman's legs. And I was like, nope, that's not true. Babies come from a woman's tummy and the tummy's open. And we kept arguing back and forth. And he's like, my dad's a doctor. So I ran home and I told my mom, you know, Mummy, this boy says, you know, X, Y, and Z. And so my mom bought, when, you know, where babies come from, and sat my brother and I down. I was 7 and he was, no, I was 9 and he was 5. So we got it quite early, you know, but it was like the mechanics of it. But it was really, but you know, at least it answered the question. But it was really when I started what in England is called secondary school. And I know you were born in the UK and you're familiar with the English school system. So secondary school would be for people watching in the US, middle school. And secondary school is middle and high school. But so when I began what is considered middle school, we had sex ed. And they showed us this really incredible film about children and why sex ed is important. And at one point, they said many children around the age, you know, when they're quite young, experiment by touching their bodies, and it can be quite pleasurable. So I went home that night and I was like, oh, I'm going to try this. And I gave myself an orgasm at the age of 11 and it was fucking fantastic. And so I thought, okay, this is what I would be telling Nana about self-discovery. So that then leads me to, you know, sex ed. This is so, for every section, I have a story for you that will lead me to, you know, your stories. So the masturbation and sex ed and what we tell children is so, all of those are so important. So can we turn your book into something like a YA book that we can give out to young Africans? How do we translate your book or take your book and make that revolution one in all the schools across our continent so that they can go through those moments that I did and go, oh, this feels good?
No, that's such a great question, Mona. And I love that you have a story for each section. And I think, that also reflects to a certain extent the reality of most people's lives, right? Because you can have a moment where you're feeling really sexually free. You can have a moment where you're like, I'm trying to figure things out. You can have a moment where you're like, I need to heal from some horrible ish. So I really love that you've got a story for each section. And I do want to hear all of your stories for each section. But to answer your question, how can we turn the book into a resource for young adults? Well, in January, the paperback edition will come out, and I do have some prompts and self-journaling prompts in that version. It is still targeted at adults, but I would actually love to do, I've been thinking about it. I'm already thinking of my next book, and yes, I have a book proposal for my book, and I started the thinking process, even done one or two interviews. Yeah. And I don't want to give too much away, but it is going to be one that can be used more as a guide. So I think it will do some of what you're asking for, Mona.
That's fantastic. I love it because, there's so much curiosity, and now there's a way for younger people especially to find each other because, there's the internet, there's TikTok. I think young Gen Z or Generation Z, whatever they call them now, so much of their learning happens online via TikTok. Yeah. So, they know that they want to find all the answers. They're very hungry for answers. The conversations among young people are so much richer and more challenging than the ones I had when I was growing up, just because we didn't have this, being able to speak to each other like this. Yeah. So I'm so excited for your next project, and I'm eager to hear all about it. And I hope we can talk about it in person at the Strand or wherever we happen to be.
Yes, we'll make that happen.
Definitely. So the second section is freedom. So and of course I have a story for freedom because, like I said, with masturbation, I said earlier that I didn't have, I wasn't intimate with another person until I was 28, 29. And for the longest time, I would say, I didn't have sex until I was 29. And I stopped myself a few years ago, and I was like, hold on. That's like, so as I said, I was giving myself orgasms since I was 11. So I was very, very familiar with my body. I was very fluent with what pleasure and desire were. I was able to pleasure myself. So I was like, why are you talking about your body as if you need a man like Christopher Columbus discovered America? No man discovered my body. It's ridiculous to say the first time I had sex with someone was with myself. So I think this is where the freedom came in, because when I look at my journey, my sexual journey, and this is why I love your book so much. And like you said, the journey changes along the way. I see how I've deliberately liberated myself from the various ways that we've all been socialized into thinking about sex and pleasure and desire. So for me, the sexual freedom is, the most important revolution is the sexual revolution, because it's a revolution that touches everyone. So how would you describe the sexual revolution? Because I'm often asked to define that. And tell us about your own ways of breaking down all of these barriers so that you can create that path towards liberation.
I feel like sexual revolution starts with the self, right? And the example you gave really, really emphasizes that. And I think it starts by questioning everything you've been told, and actually, especially when it comes to the subject of sex, expanding your understanding of sex. I used to say for a really long time, I was a virgin until I was, 23. And then I started to really think about that. I went to a single sex boarding school, and I had lots of sexual intimacies with girls. Like, why did I completely disregard that? And so when I started to reflect on that, I was like, oh my gosh, I had sex ages ago. I just did not have consensual penetrative sex with a man, but it doesn't mean I didn't have sex, right? So that's again expanding my understanding of sex. And again, it's telling me something about my own desire and what feels desirable to me, right? So once I did that, I was like, okay, so do I want to do this again more intentionally? And the answer was absolutely yes. So again, a whole different world of pleasure opened up for me. And I really think that's how you start, right? It's by questioning what you've been told. It's by being really open and honest with yourself about what you desire. I think it's also about giving yourself space to experiment, and also not to be scared to experiment, to try things out. I feel like in every area of life, we acknowledge that the more you do something, the better you become. But somehow when it comes to sex, there's this sort of, shyness around experimenting. And I think we just need to like play and allow ourselves to learn and make mistakes, and obviously do that safely, or as safely as possible, because we know there's no such thing as safe sex. There is only safe sex. But yeah, I think we actually learn by doing and by giving ourselves permission to.
Yeah. Absolutely, because like I said earlier, I wished I had this book and I could talk to other people about having sex with someone other than myself when I did begin to be intimate with another person. And I remember at the time, the only people that I could, so I didn't know who among my Egyptian friends were having sex, who among my Muslim friends were having sex. So a lot of the conversations I was having about sex were with people who were neither Egyptian nor Muslim. And so they were rarely able to understand the complications and the guilt and the shame and how difficult it had been, and that's why I love the stories that you have curated here, because they speak exactly to that. When one woman says to you how long it took her to get over the voices in her head, or especially the journeys of women like yourself and myself with polyamory, because, I decided, seeing as I want to be free, I cannot be monogamous. The ultimate freedom for me is to be polyamorous, to be non-monogamous. So was it difficult for especially women who were still living on the continent, who understood that, they still lived in very conservative surroundings? Was it difficult to get them to open up, or were they relieved to have someone to tell these stories to?
I think most of the women I interviewed just really enjoyed and appreciated that they could speak to somebody, about this subject that we're often not told to speak about. And also because I've been blogging about sex for a long time and also sharing my own personal stories, I think that helped a lot of women trust me. I also give people the choice to either use their real names and be anonymous, right? So depending upon how people felt, they made that decision for themselves. And a lot of people told me things, and at the end of the conversation, they would say something along the lines of, "You're the first person I've ever told this," or, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know I was going to reveal so much." A lot of people said the conversations felt therapeutic for them. I'm still in touch with many of the women I interviewed, people reach out to me, they tell me, "Oh my gosh, somebody said to me, I read the story and I thought that could be you." And I told them that was me. So I've had people out themselves like their friends and all sorts of things. So it's actually been really good. Yeah. And I feel like, again, this is also about the power of talking, right? About sex and about difficult subjects. That process of talking can in and of itself be quite healing.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that people were sharing stories and saying, "Hey, I recognized you," and all of that. And, there is something about telling our stories when patriarchy has silenced so many of us in so many ways, because the first event that we had for Feminist Giant and the Strand Book Club was in July, and it was with Dr. Mira Shah about her book, "You're the Only One I've Told, the stories behind abortion." And in a very similar manner to what you just said, the people who spoke to her, the pregnant people who spoke to her, all invariably said, "I've never told anyone this before." And, many of the people, or several of the people you speak to and that Dr. Shah spoke to were trans or non-binary. But what I'm about to say specifically is about cis women. I truly believe that the most subversive thing a woman can do is to talk about her life as if it matters. And of course, trans and non-binary friends, I'm sure, would agree, because they're marginalized in so many ways. But, I can only speak about my experience as a cis woman. And it's subversive because we've been silenced in so many ways and told it's not important. It's not, it's not academic. It's not theory. It's not the stuff that belongs, in universities. This is just your personal story. Who cares about your personal story? But look what happens when someone cares. And I especially love so what I considered one of the best ways that you showed love and care was that at the start of every story, you have a short preamble and you share something from your own life, whether it's how you met that person or something from your own life that connects to that story. It was such an act of love and solidarity, which, two things that really mattered to me. Why did you decide to do that?
Thank you so much. I have my wonderful US editor, Alessandra, to thank for that, right? Because I always had in the book, like my own story right at the end. And, when Alessandra bought the book, my publisher in the US is Astra House, she said, I would love to get more of you in this book. I actually want to hear more of your story. I want to hear how you met these women, what the connection was. And so I thought, okay, I'm almost going to do a little sort of love note at the start of each story and just speak to that, right? And so I really love hearing this feedback about how for you that came across as an act of care and solidarity. But also for me, it was also really important to include my own story, right? Sex is still a subject that is seen as shameful, especially if you're a woman who is passionate about sex and speaks openly about sex. And I did not think it would be fair for me to ask people to, share their deepest intimacies with me, and then I don't share back, right? Because that was also kind of how the conversation happened. It was very often a conversation, and sometimes I would share with women as well my own experience when I was interviewing them. And I felt like it would only be fair to do that in the book as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I remember in 2005 when I went back to Egypt to take part in some protests that were, catalysts for the revolution in 2011. But even, for the smallest of protests that we used to have, we always used to say, we're breaking down the barrier of fear by showing people that we are protesting. And that breaking down the barrier of fear also happens in sharing our personal stories. Because like you say, you can't expect someone to challenge taboo and stigma without ourselves challenging taboo and stigma, and that itself becomes the inspiration and becomes not just an inspiration. It's like someone holding your hand and saying, let's jump together, here's my story, what's yours? And that act of storytelling is so powerful, and it's especially so in the healing section. And my story for you for healing, I mean, I'm sure that I've written about it and spoken about it. I've written about all of these stories, but like so many of us, I've been sexually assaulted. I've lost count of how many times I've been sexually assaulted. And one of the major times was by the Egyptian regime's police forces during our revolution. And it was during a particularly iconic protest in November of 2011 when the riot police also broke both my arms. But what was telling in the way that they sexually assaulted me that night was that they sexually assaulted me 12 other women. And those 12 other women were unable to speak publicly about what happened to them because of the shame and taboo and stigma, or because their families silenced them. So to be able to read these stories that you have in your wonderful book, and to see women, whether they share their real name or not, and have such a loving and caring listener portray their stories, was so powerful. So it was really like, it kind of took me aback that you ended with healing, because I thought, oh wow, that's a bold decision. But I understand why, because that's like the revolution come to fruition now. So talk to us more about healing and the necessity of speaking about these painful stories.
Yes, I mean, I feel like, healing is an ongoing process, a bit like the journey towards sexual freedom. And I don't think one has to come before the other, right? I don't think if you haven't healed, you can't explore what freedom would look like for yourself. But I feel like healing is something that requires time. I think it looks different for everybody. I think sometimes it can be almost too easy a solution to say, oh, go for therapy, right? That may not work, or conventional therapy may not work for some people. Other people may have other types of healing they want to explore. So for example, Warres, the woman I mentioned earlier, who had experienced female genital mutilation, part of what for her was trying MDMA therapy, right? There were people that I interviewed who spoke about actually celibacy as a way of healing, going on a journey of self-love, which included abstaining from sex, people who went on spiritual retreats. And for me, it was really interesting to learn more about the various ways in which people healed. One woman's healing was by becoming an activist, right? And people actually think of activism as a form of healing. But I think it's a really powerful form of healing, experiencing oppression and saying, I don't want other people to experience this, and I'm going to do everything I can to stop other people from experiencing this. And I also think it's part of, it's part of life. It's part of what we experience as women, whether we're cis or trans, and it's also, an important process in our ongoing journey towards sexual freedom.
What has the reaction been like from, let's start with your family. Have you spoken to your family about your book?
Yes, my mom actually has like all the editions of my book that are out prominently displayed in her living room.
Oh.
And when the book came out, she, the high school that she went to, they have a WhatsApp group, right? So she sent them, some information about the book, and she was like, "Oh, my daughter's written this book. It's a bit controversial." And one of her friends was like, "Are you sure it's controversial? Maybe you're old-fashioned." So that was actually a really nice reaction. And my dad was always supportive. Obviously, I've been working on the book for a long time, so he was constantly asking me, when are you finishing your book? When are you finishing your book? Sadly, he passed due to COVID before the book came out. But
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is what it is. Like, we've all suffered so many losses. But yeah, my family has actually been very supportive. I think they've been on their own journey, especially like my parents. When I first started blogging about sex, they were like, "Oh my goodness, why do you have to put like your private life out there?" And when I started winning awards for the blog, they were like, "Oh, are you going to take us out for dinner?" So I think with recognition, and also obviously like, positive feedback, they've understood why I have chosen to do what I do.
I turned on the light because it's almost dark here in New York. I'm in the light now. I've seen the light, Nana.
Yes, we can see you better now.
I know. I was like, the sun was setting, and I was like, I better turn the light on. Although I do enjoy these conversations in the dark because it gives it this allure, But we're doing everything in the bright and like sunshine of truth and revelation. So I'm so glad.
Almost real life.
Yes, exactly. I'm so glad that your family is supportive. I'm sorry about the loss of your father, but I'm so glad that your mother and her group, share these stories, because, I was telling you earlier that I watched a clip of you with Christiane Amanpour on her show, and she brought up a film that is a favorite of mine. And this is an issue that I want to talk to you about, especially because, you talked about your mom and her friends. Older women, because Christiane brought up a film that I wrote a review about as well, called Good Luck to You, Leo Grande. And the film centers a woman who I think is 60, a woman in her 60s, who never had an orgasm with her husband, and she's recently widowed, and she hires a much younger male sex worker to go through a list of sexual acts that she wants to do that she's never experienced before. And, I'm 55, and, and I've been thinking about sex and my attitude towards sex and pleasure and desire as I go through menopause. And you're just talking about your mother and her friends. And the oldest person you profile that you interviewed in your book is 71. And I was delighted when I read her story. I was like, yes, oh my God, I need to read a story about, yes, there is sex in my future. So let's talk about older women and sex a bit before we continue with reactions of other people.
I loved my interviews with the older woman. Like, both the two oldest women I interviewed are both in the freedom section. And for me, it's not surprising.
Yes.
And
I love them both because one of them is polyamorous as well. And I was like, yes, exactly. Yes, me.
It's a huge source of inspiration, for me. I'm perimenopausal right now. And, I think the media traditionally has tended to depict older women as somehow sexless. And, I've actually had quite a few conversations with older women, also for my podcast, Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women. Let me just plug that quickly. It's been really good to hear that, older women are actually having really enjoyable sex lives. They're feeling confident in their body. They're exploring more. They find that they're desired by people of all ages. And this is something that we never really see commonly portrayed in the media. And I think we need more stories like that. I think it will also help younger women, because there's all of this pressure to sort of settle down by a certain age. And people somehow feel like, oh, I'm not going to meet anybody if I don't get married by the age of 30, or if I'm not partnered by the age of 30. And I think hearing more stories by older women in terms of how they're navigating sex and desire might actually take off that pressure from younger people and allow them to just be, and not feel like, I need to attach myself to somebody or else I'm going to be left on the proverbial shelf.
Absolutely. Or to stay in something abusive or something where love and desire no longer exist. All of that. So important.
Yeah.
And then what about your peers and when you go to festivals and book signings and stuff, especially on the continent? Let's start with the continent. How's reaction been like?
You know, the feedback that most warms my heart has come from particularly young queer people saying to me, I've never felt so seen in a book. And that really just makes me extremely happy, you know. And for example, in Kenya, there was a woman that I interviewed for my book called Philista. She's a sex worker rights activist. When I was last in Kenya, she held an event for me with sex workers and trans people. And, you know, yeah, she told me, like, you know what, we as sex workers, we feel like such ownership over this book. And she was saying how in Kenya, booksellers invite her to come and do readings about the book, you know.
Oh, wow.
Like, I get more customers now. People are booking me from London, the US. And I was just like, oh, wow, I am so happy. This is also like really contributed to your income as well. Yeah, but those kind of reactions, you know, especially people who have traditionally not felt seen in media, feeling seen by my book has made me really happy.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad. And then your book has, you know, stories, you know, a gamut of stories. Some of the stories are very painful, and some of the stories are not so painful. We've already touched on the stereotype aspect, but I remember when I was touring with my first book, because I touched on also a lot of difficult stories. I was like a mix of protective and also wanting, because it's my right to talk about my culture, my people, all of that. But when I was traveling with the book outside of Egypt, you know, the Middle East, Southwest Asia, call it what you want, North Africa, I was very wary of having any Western audiences, especially white Western audiences, think that it was just where I come from that these painful stories exist. So has that been a challenge for you when you travel, or is that not an issue?
It's a great question. One of the things I've noticed is when I tend to do readings, I tend to read more from the self-discovery and freedom section. I rarely read from the healing section, right? Because it is tough. And I think it's like also tough on me, right? Like emotionally to read those stories. And I guess I feel like usually when you go to a book event, you want to hear something that's positive or light. And the healing stories are in there for people to read in their own lecture and to process and to have the space and time to process. So I think this is how I've dealt with that, you know, by sticking more to the uplifting stories and like public events.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm so glad. And Nana, I could talk to you for hours, but I have to share you with the people who are watching us. And I know that there's already one question already, a very good one, actually. And I hope everyone else watching will be inspired to ask equally good questions. You already have a question about how, so I'm guessing that this has to do with the US and abortion, and how, you know, the conservatives in the US have been united in their desire and now victory to destroy abortion rights for so many pregnant people across the US. And the question comes from a person who says that conservatives are usually very united and they can fight to achieve a certain goal because of their unity through that discipline. Whereas we, you know, the other side, if you like, we're individuals and we don't often have that coalescing around this kind of like common, albeit evil goal. So I think they're asking how can we work to push back against conservatives and the rights, our bodily autonomy that they unite to strip us of?
It's a great question. I don't actually feel that we are actually not united. I think it depends which movement, if you consider yourself to be a part of a movement. I consider myself to be a part of the African feminist movement. And so I don't feel like I'm of course an individual, but I'm also part of like a force of vibrant people who are trying to create change in the world. And I feel like change can be created in a number of ways, right? Through direct action, some of which you've given examples of, Mona, in terms of like the struggle in Egypt, for example. It can be created through the media, right? Sometimes we need to help people imagine new possibilities, and that's where art comes in, and the work of writers and painters. It can be in any number of ways how you bring up your own children differently. And I think it can be easy to feel disempowered when you see conservatives making major wins. But I think it's also important to recognize that, you know, the sort of backlash that we're experiencing is as a result of gains we've made. You know, and so we are actually in a position where we do not only need to hold the line to preserve gains we've made, but sometimes we need to go back and start the fight again, right? And go back and fight, you know, battles we thought we had previously won. And yeah, I think we just need to stay motivated. And so I guess my recommendation for anybody who feels like they're an individual and they want to be part of a movement is just to actually find a group or collective to join that's contributing to the kind of change you want to see in the world.
Yes. Thank you, Nana. That's all. I'm nodding and like very wise. Thank you. You have another question about potentially second part to the book. Are you planning a follow-up to interview more women on the continent? What about it?
Yes. So I have started, I'm really at the beginning stages of my next book. It's not going to be the same as this book. It will still be about sex, you know, because I'm really interested in unearthing and sharing African feminist knowledge. You know, I will, of course, interview lots of people, but the process is going to be different and the way the book is presented is going to be really different. I'm describing my next book as part memoir, part African feminist social commentary with a dose of inspiration.
I love it. I can't wait. So Nana, you have another question here. Were there any common themes from the interviews from women who are menopausal? And would you consider focusing on older women?
It's a great question. I'm actually really obsessed with older women. I think the older I get, I'm now in my 40s, the more interested I am in, like, you know, speaking to older women, especially about sex. At the time that I was doing these interviews, I really didn't ask anybody a question about menopause and it didn't come up. So that's not reflected. I'm super interested in the project that Mona, you are doing around, you know, menopause and those kind of stories. So I will find a way to like tap into that project. So
please contribute. I would love you to write a chapter, an essay.
Yes, I would love to. So yeah, unfortunately, I didn't like draw out any themes around the menopause specifically.
Let me check if there are any more questions, because if there aren't, I'm going to ask you questions because I know I have tons. Okay, well, there's another one. What are some of the major causes of African feminism now?
It's a great question. I would say, you know, there isn't just one battle. I think there are several battles that are being fought concurrently. And also probably the battle that people will be most concerned about will depend upon where they themselves sit, right? Because I write about sex and I am particularly passionate about sex and sexualities, I'm really concerned about the battle for queer lives, frankly, you know, and really created more space for people to be free, to be who they are, to identify as they wish, to love who they love. So for me, that's like one of the major causes that I am particularly passionate about. But then, you know, on the continent, there are also, in a sense, lots of basic issues that I am, you know, really passionate about, like healthcare, for instance, you know, and people having access to healthcare is a super important one for me. And obviously with that also includes abortion rights, because in my country, for example, even though ironically, the law is actually quite expansive and allows people to have abortions under many, many conditions, there's a lot of stigma when it comes to abortion. So much stigma that people believe they do not have the right to ask for abortions and rather seek backstreet abortions, which is the leading cause of maternal mortality rates, you know, in Ghana. So that's also one of the issues that I'm super concerned about. You know, some African feminists may be concerned about land rights, for example, wanting women to have access to land because land in pre-colonial times especially was held in common. And obviously with capitalism now, you know, a lot of individuals have ownership over land, and that affects women, especially if they are not allowed to inherit property. So yeah, there's so many battles and causes. Yes.
And they're being fought, and there are feminists who are fighting them. And I think this is another excellent reminder that your book gives us, that feminism does not live in one particular part of the world. Feminism is transnational, it's global, and it's very much alive and fighting on our continent. And we have another question, and I think it might be our last because we're coming up to the top of the hour. Are you still in touch with your interviewees?
I'm in touch with quite a lot of them. So, you know, I made sure everybody got a book. Some of them I speak to, some of them, they reach out to me from time to time. One of them expressed that interest and, you know, adopting the book or some of the stories into a screenplay. So that's actually been really great as well. You know, it's like this you know, community of women that, yeah, we go back and forth and chit chat from time to time. And that's also been really special.
I love it because reading their stories, first of all, I feel like I know them. And second of all, I feel like I've been listening in on a therapy session and it's like, I need to go to therapy. It's reminded me I need to start therapy again. So I'm actively looking for a therapist. Your book has just been so wonderful, Nana. I truly loved it. It's like it's such a great companion to me now. So thank you for this glorious book.
Thank you so much, Mona. Thank you for your incredible work, for the space you create, for how you support us, how you love on us. Really, truly appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nana. That's so kind of you. And I look forward to meeting you not too far in the future now, because, you know, South Africa, Nigeria, London last year. So one of these days, I hope we can have a conversation like this in person in New York. And, you know, and then you'll see how enthusiastic, I mean, you've seen already, I was there at your event in London, but, you know, New York also has a lot of love for you. So we need to show you that love in person one of these days.
Yes, I can't wait to be there in person.
Excellent. And I think, you know what, I think I have one more. Oh, hold on. There's a Q&A. Oh, someone just gave us a very, very late question. Okay. Oh, someone says, this is not a question, but I just want to say, I love this book. I take it with me everywhere I go to introduce it to other women. Isn't that lovely?
That's lovely. That's a perfect comment to end on. Thank you so much, Alison.
Thank you, everyone who's joined. And what I wish everyone who's joined would do is to get a copy of this book, several copies of this book, give them to people, just like Alison said now, and just tell them, read this book and let it wash over you and just sit there and reflect. I mean, I sat there with a pen, not even a pencil, so I didn't have a pencil at the time, and just write down your thoughts, because it's truly like being in the best kind of therapy or among the best friends, because it just brings up so many memories and just makes you think, gosh, yeah, I have lived and I continue to live a very rich life.
Thank you so much, Mona. Thank you. This has been just a brilliant event, and thank you to the Strand.
Thank you so much, Nana and Mona, for a fantastic conversation. I genuinely enjoyed it, and I honestly cannot wait for the next book. I cannot wait for the next Feminist Giant event. I'm looking forward to it. If you have not purchased The Sex Lives of African Women yet, the link is in the chat. Mona's books are also in the chat for purchase. Anything else you two would like to plug? Please have at it.
Nana, would you like to plug anything? Tell us.
Yes, I have a podcast out now. It's also called Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women. It's available everywhere you listen to podcasts. It's conversations with African women, with men, with gender non-conforming people about sex, sexualities, and pleasure. And, you know, if you love my book, you would definitely love the podcast.
Everyone go and subscribe to the podcast right now.
Yes, I will right now. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and have a great evening.
Bye, everybody. Bye.